Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the president of publishing and marketing at Boom Studios. It's Filip Sablik. Thanks for coming on, Filip.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. It's been a while.
It has been. It was a couple of years, actually a few years. We've talked for other pieces, though, so I feel like it seems like we're regularly talking, just not for the podcast.
Yeah, and I think the last time was either ahead or after ComicsPRO. I can't remember, so it was very fitting that we're back at it.
Well, we are recording this the week before ComicsPRO's annual meeting in Pittsburgh, the first in-person one since 2020, right before the pandemic. I mean, like right before. That's one of like the weird things. It was like a week and a half or something, or 2 weeks before everything shut down. How are you feeling on the buildup? Are you excited, nervous, ready to rumble? Where are you at?
Excited, I think. Yeah, excited. I'm not nervous because last year I did Comic-Con and then I went to Baltimore Comic-Con for the Diamond Retailer Summit. So I've been back at events that had more people at them, because ComicsPRO is a little bit more contained. But I'm excited. I'm excited to get back in person. I really miss the energy and the just kind of the momentum you get out of meeting with people in person and the exchange of ideas and seeing people's reaction in real time to things that you're excited about. It's really validating. So
I went to, I think it was 2018's ComicsPRO annual meeting in Portland. And obviously I couldn't go into most of the sessions because I am the vile press and I would be just leaking things like crazy, assuredly. But that was one of the things I think was really cool about it is, for a group that's often vilified as being a bunch of very negative people, it was a very enthusiastic group who were just really passionate about making things happen and like talking to each other about how they can do things better. Now, as soon as they leave, maybe that changes. But at the same time, the entire time I was in Portland during that event, it just felt like, I don't know, unusually positive, even compared to comic conventions.
Yeah, I think that's that tends to be the case with ComicsPRO because ComicsPRO is an organization you have to pay into to be a member. I think it self-selects, for people that are looking to make the industry better and are looking to like engage, sometimes in a really, vigorous manner with like distributors and publishers. But the end goal is ultimately to improve things. Whereas like if what you're looking to do is to complain, there are plenty of other places you can do that for free.
Yeah, that's true. I know you normally have a big keynote speech. I mean, I don't know if you always do it, but it's always like, I think a thing you normally prep for. Is this typically an event you normally do a lot of prep for, even relative to other conventions? Because you do have to have that specific type of engagement and everything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of it is because it happens in February, right? So it really
kicks off the year.
Thank God, kicks off the year, right? God help us all if somebody entrepreneurially decides to do a comic convention in January, but yeah, so it kind of kicks off the year. And so for us with the retail community, we're coming out of the holiday sales season. By mid-February, we've got a pretty good idea of what the environment looked like over the holidays, and we can come in and at least from the Boom perspective, set the tone for the rest of the year, right? And telegraph kind of, here's what we think the year is going to look like. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's how we're going to help you have a great year. And that's different than, even something like San Diego Comic-Con, where we might do like a Diamond Retailer lunch and speak to arguably a similar quantity of retailers. But at that point, you're mid-year, you're kind of having that conversation in an environment where there's so much noise and so many other things being announced and talked about that what's cool about ComicsPRO is it's just focused. It's really about comic shops. It's about the retail space and what publishers and distributors and retailers are doing together.
Yeah. And for listeners that don't know this, ComicsPRO is a trade organization for retailers, and their annual meeting is a place where retailers, creators, publishers, etc. get together every once in a while, like a lurking comics journalist over off on the side who just intermittently will talk to you about things such as myself will go to. And it is really interesting that it happens in February, though, because in a lot of ways it's ideal because it's before the con season starts. it's before things really get crazy. But also the first quarter is typically the worst for just comics retail in general.
Yeah, it's funny. I haven't talked to anybody at ComicsPRO about why they do it in February, but if I had to guess, I think that first quarter tends to be a little bit slower. So if you're asking retailers, particularly owners and managers, to leave their store, and typically the event runs like for 3 days, and if you factor in the travel time, you're really asking people to step away from their store for anywhere from 3 to 5 days. And so I think that probably has a big part to do with it. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if leading off the year is a strategic choice on the part of ComicsPRO. It's like, let's get in there first and set the tone for the conversation.
Is there anything you're specifically curious about as you head into the event? Because it is the first time. I mean, I'm sure you've been talking to retailers this entire time since the last ComicsPRO in person, but this will be the first time you really get to be in person with everybody. You get everyone's in one place, all these like notable retailers who really care about the industry. Is there something you're specifically curious about asking them, or is it more about being available and listening to retailers and others who attend?
For us, one of the things I always look for is validating whether our picture of the industry, our picture of reality is true, or is accurate. And so going in, like you said, we talk to retailers all the time. We're paying attention to not just, retailer forums, but sites such as Sketched. When you're doing the roundup articles, our team's looking at that and reading that and inferring, and gathering information. And we're pulling that all together to form a picture of what does the comics market as a whole look like, And so, we're going to go in with some ideas around that, and we're going to be looking for feedback to either, adjust our picture or validate that, hey, this is, what reality looks like for most retailers. And I think the big difference between like in-person and virtual is we've all been in that Zoom with like more than 4 people. And the reality is the loudest voice is going to dominate in that environment, right? Whereas when you're sitting at a round table, there's a greater chance that like you're going to get a dialogue going between a group of people. And in our case, when you're doing 20 or 30 round tables over the course of 2 days, you're going to get a lot of points of input that you can then, kind of coalesce into a vision for what's happening. And I'm sure, one of the challenges you have is when you're doing these industry pieces, you're limited by the number of people you can talk to, right? So it's like it's always great, like the folks you talk to are, I would say, fantastic, some of the best in class. And I think you in particular, not to turn this into like why I think Sketched is great conversation, I do, but the challenge there is that like even if you're kind of geographically diverse, you're by virtue of the fact these are retailers, they're willing to like come on and do a podcast or do an interview. They're kind of self-selecting, or you're selecting for like, here's the kind of strata of retailer that I'm talking to. And so I love going to ComicsPRO because it's 100 different retailers, and even if they are primarily the ones that are excited about moving the industry forward and kind of, let's call them progressive, not just in the political sense typically, but also just in the moving the business forward kind of sense. It's still 100 people. It's a pretty good sample size, and you're going to get different points of view.
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the difficult things is when you're talking about, let's say roughly speaking, like 3,000 plus individual retail shops. These are all going to be colored by their owners, by their staff, by what they order, what their priorities are, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you can talk to like 10 shops, and those 10 shops represent those 10 shops, but they don't necessarily represent the whole, because every shop is very different. Even like, if you consider like a lot of the people who, speak publicly a lot, you talk about like, Jen Haynes, the president of ComicsPRO, but also the owner of The Dragon. You talk about like Brian Hibbs with Comics Experience. You talk about Brandon Schatz has Variant Edition, and he also, and Danica LeBlanc, and he writes a column over at The Beat. Those are 3 shops that are very prominent, and all 3 of them are way different. way different in terms of how many shops they have, way different in what they sell,
Yeah.
way different in their emphasis, way different in how long they've been doing this. I mean, Brian's been doing this since the 80s. And so it's like getting into those roundtables and actually being able to pick it up in aggregate. Because if one person says you need to change this, that isn't meaningful unless you get like, I don't know, 50 other people saying you need to change this.
Yeah. And usually because in my experience, because retailers only have their environment, their specific locality, the way their store runs to potentially suggest solutions. What I'm most interested in is like, help me identify the problem. And I'm open, like, give me ideas for solutions, but chances are, the solution that would be ideal for one store is not going to work kind of across the board. And I think even when you talk about, like you said, like Brian's incredibly smart, been in the business a long time, but I think in one of like your last articles, you also talked to Eitan, right? Who's like arguably, now Oakland is not San Francisco, but they're not geographically that far apart. And those two stores are having two very different experiences with their customers, with how the market is behaving. And certainly, talking to somebody like Patrick and Dahl from Challengers Comics, they're not going to be able to speak for even all of Chicago retailers, because there's such a diverse, audience there. There's so many different stores that can survive and thrive in that environment that you really have to get a good sampling.
So when you go into something like ComicsPRO, are you looking more for what's working or what isn't? Like, is there a difference there? Because it seems to me that like you could get a lot of compliments on like how Breyer's doing or something like that, but that's not really actionable. Like, there's not a lot to learn from that. Are you looking more for kind of problems they might have?
Yes, but I think where like we do get compliments and look, I think we've been in the fortunate position that for probably the last 5 years, Boom as a company is not walking into ComicsPRO primarily to deal with problems. We're fortunate that we get a lot of compliments. So usually the question I'll ask is like, great, Breyer's working. Why? Like, talk to me about what is it about that series that's connecting with your customers, or what is it that we did that you feel like helped that connection happen, because we want to be able to replicate it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we go into it with ideas and theories, but it's always helpful to get that other perspective from the other side.
I do think one of the interesting things about the direct market right now is, and you might have heard this, when Patrick Brower was on my podcast last month, when he came on, he said they were up at Challengers Comics and Conversation, their shop in Chicago, last year by 0.5%, and they're happy for it. But as Patrick basically said, we'd be a lot happier if we really understood why. And I think that that's one of the interesting things is like the why of the current situation is so perplexing to a lot of shops, where it's like, even when you're up, it doesn't really feel like up, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that's one of our big, when I talk about what our picture of the industry is, one of the things that we're landing on is that the fracturing of the distribution landscape means that the time that retailers previously might have spent learning about new titles, hand selling, engaging with kind of like, how am I going to optimize the opportunities in my store? What are my customers reacting to? Having those conversations is now in some large part being spent on just administrative tasks and logistics, right? Even something as simple as, and I know Patrick talked about this, it's like in 2019, boxes for a lot of retailers showed up once a week from Diamond, and everything showed up at once. And so you could build your week around, the boxes are going to show up roughly at this time. I'm going to unpack them. I've got my intake process, and then I'm done, and that wasn't true for every store, but I think for a lot of stores that was the case. And so now having boxes show up every day, that's a big shift.
Yeah, I mean, it really cuts into your time that you can do hand selling. It really cuts into your time where you can like kind of find new ways to push your books and stuff. And, shops are finding ways around it. But I mean, Patrick put it to me in a piece that I have coming up for Publishers Weekly that basically by all of the distribution partners kind of quintupling, the work is quintupled. And what do you do with that? Time is arguably the most valuable resource retailers have, and they're being, I mean, this is a dramatic way to put it, or maybe some people would suggest I'm being not as dramatic as I should be, but they're being robbed of it. And like that's a lot to work with. But let's focus on Boom for a little bit. You know, I told you before that I want to talk about kind of what's working, what's not, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't the why of it all. We'll get into the why of it all in a bit, but like from your perspective, what's working right now for Boom? Like, do you have a good sense as to, I don't want to say the formula, but kind of what your playbook needs to be based off of the past couple of years of successes?
Yeah, I do. And I think I might refine that a little bit because I think we are at a point, an inflection point in the market right now where we can't look at the past few years of successes because I think the market is changing. And in some ways, what happened in 2020 and 2021 were anomalies driven by a lot of external factors, right? The pandemic is the obvious one, but kind of like cascading down from that in the US, money coming in from the government, uh, people looking for places to maybe invest in kind of like non-traditional investment categories because the stock market looked perplexing or scary or whatever the case might be. And then there was also even something maybe as invisible to some folks at this point is, in 2020, a lot of publishers halted or slowed production
Yep.
pretty dramatically, right? And so if you look at the just output in pure volume of number of series in 2020 versus 2022, very different, right? And I think Comicron just did like a whole breakdown of, different publishing lines and output over month that kind of reinforce this. And so I think we kind of have to look at where did we have growth in 2021 and to a certain extent 22. How can we hold on to as much of that as possible, but kind of check that against the reality of what we know to be true about the market pre-pandemic, right? In terms of like customer behavior and what the market's willing to bear. So in terms of Boom, I think what's working for us is in some ways, and this hopefully doesn't sound like a cop-out, but it's what's worked for us historically, which is curating the line and making sure that like everything we bring to market, we not only believe in, but we know who we're selling to and why they should buy it and be able to message that out, in a very clean way. In some ways, I think it's gotten more challenging to do that because what I would say is if you look at 21, there was still such a hunger and we were still kind of catching up to the demand that we were seeing as an industry that you didn't have to work as hard to make that sale, right? Like people were coming into the stores every week going like, give me more. What do you got? What's the new number one? What's the new series I can get into? And now I think we're a little bit closer to where we were in 2019, where like there is that audience. And I would argue the audience is probably larger than it was in 2019, but now you're going to have to convince them that your series is worth their dollars over somebody else's series that week.
I do think it's kind of funny that you said that you can't look at the past couple of years as a guide, but also you are using your historical plan as a guide. But I do think, to support the reason why you would say something like that, I'm not going to name any names, but I do think that there were some publishers who saw the environment of 2020 and 2021 as an opportunity to produce more, to publish more, to sell more really quickly. And that resulted in the market getting flooded to some degree. And those entities not being able to sustain based off of that. And to your credit, I mean, Boom has been pretty consistent about how many titles you publish a month for years now, right?
Yeah, basically if you look at kind of post-pandemic 20 through 22, we've been flat on an annual basis in terms of how many series we put out, right? And look, like I think the last couple times you and I chatted, we talked about the proliferation of variant covers, and hopefully I'm not like jumping ahead too far.
Oh, we'll definitely talk about variants, but yeah, we can talk about here too.
Yeah, but like I think we're certainly we certainly engaged in that as enthusiastically as other publishers, and there was a market for it, and we were trying to serve that market. And I think there's still a market for it, but there does need to be one of the things we're seeing is you can tell when you start to hit that oversaturation tipping point, and how do you adjust for that and publish responsibly to where like ultimately what you want to do is that customer who is excited by variant covers and is getting something out of it, you want them to walk away feeling satisfied and satiated and not taken advantage of, right?
Hmm.
And that's it's a tightrope to walk. It's every business struggles with this to a certain extent, right? Like how do you maximize the opportunity without deflating your your customer base over time because they feel like it's too much, So that's definitely something we think about a lot.
Just to jump to the variants, like you've had a lot of success with them. There's a significant number of them as well. As I'm sure you've heard and I'm sure you've seen, like a lot of retailers have told me that the collector slash speculator market is dying back a little bit. Perhaps partially for the reasons you're saying, also just because economic uncertainty going on right now, just the environment's just way different than it has been the past few years. It seems like the most crucial part of variance is like trying to find the right balance. Is that a constant effort to try and read the market and how it's responding to variance and make sure that you don't overwhelm it while serving the books as well as possible?
Yeah. I hate to give you like a one-word answer, but yes.
Well, that was easy.
That's exactly what it is, like every single month we're reading signals from the market and looking at how things are performing, how and not just kind of based on the orders or the sell through and attrition from issue to issue, but we're looking at what are the reactions online from the customer base that we're trying to serve, right? Are they excited about it? Are they exhausted by it? Are they starting to complain about, oh, I can't keep up with this? Those are the early warning signs that you need to pay attention to and adjust. And one of the things, we're doing this year is, in reaction to that, we're going to be pulling back on, I was looking at our variant cover output for the first half of 23 versus the first half of 22, and we're going to be pulling back by about 15%. Now that's, maybe to some people will be very noticeable, maybe to other folks will not be noticeable at all, but it is, making those adjustments to react to the market that I think is responsible publishing, right?
Well, you got to mix the quantitative with the qualitative, because if you just go off of sales, like orders will probably maintain, but that might lead to exhaustion from your retailer partners, exhaustion from your customer or from their customers, et cetera, et cetera. And, I'm curious, like when it comes to variance in specific, I mean, I'm sure this is true across the board for all kinds of different subjects, but do you think that there's a line between what's right for the publisher and what's right for retailers? Because, there are some books, not yours necessarily, that come with like so many variants that they literally run out of alphabets, letters in the alphabet, and they have to keep cycling through. Do you think that there's a line between those two sides, or do you think that they're one and the same?
I don't think it's a uniform answer. Even in retailer forums, when I watch conversations, there are like some retailers that go, it's way too much. It's wasting my time. It's distracting me. There's not an audience for it. And then you'll have another retailer step in and say, I don't stock these on my shelf, but I actually make a fair amount of money off of them from pre-order subscriptions, right? So this is valuable to me and it's driving revenue into my store. And so I think it's a tough question to answer to
Sure.
a certain extent. And maybe there's not one right answer, but I do think that what we're always trying to balance is maybe what's good for the short term versus what's good for the long term. And when push comes to shove, I always like to err towards the long term because as I'm fond of saying, I don't know how to do anything else. So I've got two kids I got to put through college, and so I want to be around doing the same thing. And I think the other maybe dynamic here is trying to also balance what is not just best for the publisher and best for the retailer, but also what's best for the creator, right? Because the reality is it's a competitive market, and if a creator has a choice between where they're going to place their books, and part of what's going to determine the like financial success of that book is whether they're able to do the variants they want to do, then that may factor into their decisions, right? If you have publisher A who's saying, well, we don't do any more than 2 covers, and another publisher that's saying you can do whatever you want, then that's going to factor in. Now, in Boom's case, we tend to drive the cover strategy. So this is, just to be clear, like those are choices we make and ultimately we're responsible for. But we get input from creators, and we know from talking with creators that, the difference between selling X number of copies and Y number of copies matters, because that impacts their royalties and their advances and everything else.
It is funny. Like, I've talked to a number of creators who work on books at Boom. Like Jason Aaron was on, and we talked about Once Upon a Time at the End of the World. And he didn't say it, but I kind of got the impression that he was like more than happy to not have to do that, because that's a really important part of the job that, frankly, it's like, how much time does one person really have? That's part of the reason why they go with Boom, right? Is so they have that kind of full service experience.
Yeah. And it's actually, I think, part of our value proposition to a lot of creators who have projects both with Boom and at Image and other publishers. It's, it's a question of how much do you want to do and how much are you able to do? And then what are the things that you either don't have time for or an interest in or the capability to take on? And how can we take that on for you as your partner and take care of it? So I think, the conversation with somebody like Jason is like, here's this project you want to do. If all you want to do is write, you can do that. And we will support you 360 degrees for every other aspect of the project. Now, if you're interested in variant covers or marketing or our sales strategy or the production design of the book, like, get in there. Let's pull you in and get your ideas into the mix.
And now, a quick word from our sponsor. The comics crowdfunding platform Zoop is rolling through 2023 with even more projects from incredible creators. This February, support campaigns such as 9 Lives from New York Times bestselling writer Steve Horton, the new Scarlet Twilight from Ben Morse, Gilgamesh Eternal from Cam Kirkhow, Volume 3 of the super successful Sex, Spies, and Rock and Roll series, and The Magic Necklace from indie comics superstar editor Claire Napier. There are even more live campaigns and more surprises to be added throughout the month, so check out zoop.gg for more. It takes less than 30 seconds to sign up, and the checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons to your cart, provide some info during the checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. Looking to crowdfund your project? Email Zoop at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign, and learn more at blog.zoop.gg. And now, back to the show. I did want to talk about one of the big wrinkles you've been rolling out the past few years. This is a huge left turn, but it does involve variants in a very specific sense. Boom's usage of Kickstarter. On I think you guys are, is it your 7th Kickstarter you're on right now?
Yes.
The current one, which is The Expanse Dragon Tooth, it's a 12-issue series that launches in April. It is putting up monster berserker-like numbers. Anytime you can start putting yourself in the scale of Keanu Reeves, that's a pretty successful thing. Kickstarter has become an increasingly utilized move for Boom. Beyond the obvious part of they've all been very successful, what's the appeal of Kickstarter for you? Do you view it as, at least in part, a path to tapping into a different audience altogether?
Yeah, that is actually one of the primary goals whenever we do a Kickstarter. There's really kind of 2 things we've identified that we think are really additive. One is, whether you're talking about somebody like Keanu Reeves, who has this massive global fan base outside of our existing channels, or The Expanse, which has this hugely passionate audience that really loves this franchise, but may not be going to comic shops, may not even be going into bookstores. Because one of the things about The Expanse that we've learned over the years is that the original kind of audience that helped drive that franchise when it was a book series first was ebooks, right? So it's a digitally native audience that likes to engage, through their phone or through their computer and tap into it. And so one of our goals with any Kickstarter we do is how do we pull in, how do we open up the funnel more, right? How do we broaden the audience? And then the second piece of it is it gives us an opportunity to make cool stuff that makes 0 sense at retail.
Like the Rossi one that was there's only 25 total in this metal slipcase, or I don't even know if I'm describing it right. That thing was insane.
It's a metal box with the books, exclusive versions of the books in it But the really crazy part is we're doing a hand terminal replica, a prop replica from the show, designed by the prop master and manufactured by the same team that like literally it's the closest thing to the real thing that you can get without being a member of the cast. Now, the cost on that is not small, which is why the price point is high and it's so limited. Um, it makes no sense at retail. And frankly, if we were offering that out to retail, we'd have to charge even more because we'd be now dealing with a wholesale price through a distributor, right? So like your margins are shrinking. So it gives us that opportunity to do cool, interesting things like that. And then like going back to the Berserker campaign, you know, being able to offer a handful of people the opportunity to get something signed by the entire creative team, including Keanu, and the ability to be drawn into the comic book and killed by Berserker in the comic book, it's a cool vehicle to do that, right? And to give those kind of experiential things and opportunities to super fans. And what we found, you know, we'll see with the Expanse, but what we saw with Berserker is that ultimately, because Kickstarter by its very nature is like a 30-day kind of supercharged marketing cycle that happens, it ends up driving more interest into the property. You know, like I think Berserker would have been very successful in comic shops, very successful in bookstores if we had not done the Kickstarter. But I strongly believe that it was more successful because we did the Kickstarter, and it created this like inflection point to drive attention to the fact that we were doing a comic book with Keanu Reeves.
You know what I think one of the interesting things about the Kickstarter efforts versus like comic shop efforts, and you know, I'm not saying that you never do this, but when I was Googling just to like make sure I had all my, you know, dot my I's and cross my T's and everything like that, I was served Google search ads for the Kickstarter campaign. And I've been I think I originally actually discovered it because I was served an ad on Facebook or Instagram. And the interesting thing about the Kickstarters is they get a very specific consumer focused push in terms of promotion. And then typically most of the direct market stuff seems to be promoted primarily at retailers. The approach for that seems like it has to be different because you have to target consumers because they're the ones who are going to be, you know, backing the Kickstarter. But I mean, is there any part of that that kind of makes you feel like maybe there should be more of a consumer oriented focus on the promotion of regular direct market comics at all?
Yeah, I think we do both. The main difference, though, and you're a digital marketing guy, so you know this, is like the benefit of having a direct to consumer channel is you have immediate data as to whether it's working or not, right? So you can modulate and increase or decrease your spend based on the return on your investment, right? And so that's really what's driving kind of, you know, the reason you're getting served up a lot of the Expanse is because it has taken off, right? So that allows us to put more money into advertising. Whereas one of the challenges there's several challenges with doing the same thing for comic shops. One is we have no idea if we're hitting the correct customer.
Right.
In most cases, there's anywhere between let's call it a week and 3 months lag between when we're making the ad spend and when that return is coming in. And we don't even have any real insight into, like, I'll give you an example. So for example, the other week we released Harrower #1, which is a new horror series from Justin Jordan and Bromavell. We did video trailers, we did first looks, we did all sorts of activations on social, and we did advertising and boosted posts. I have no real way of knowing anytime soon what the effect of that was on sell-through in comic shops, right? Because that data is behind a wall. It's a step further than what we have with the book market, because with the book market, I can go and run ads specifically targeting a graphic novel release, or I can have Keanu Reeves make a late night appearance and I can see the next day what the impact is on point of sale. And with comic shops, it's like you said, 2,000, 2,500 independent businesses that do not report any information back. And so you have to take much more of like a traditional broadcast advertising approach, right? Which is, it's very general. It's like, David, even think about it from this level. Like, I can advertise for Harrower #1. I could target, because we have the ability with digital advertising, Facebook, Instagram, and I could say, okay, I'm going to hit Alaska and specifically your area
Right.
as a hotbed of like, this is where I'm going to like crank up the advertising. I actually have no idea if, I assume Bosco's carries
They do.
Boom Books and has our new #1s, but I don't know that for a fact. Like, I don't know where the inventory is, right? So it's a function of how the system, I think, is set up. So, part of what we're looking at, just to bring it back to like ComicsPRO this year, part of what we're looking at doing this year is, how do we shift some of our promotional and advertising efforts up earlier into that initial order period, so that if nothing else, we're tightening that window, right? And we can run advertising in weeks 1 and 2. And by week 4, we got some sense of, okay, here's where we expected the numbers to come in on initials. Here's where they've come in. And now let's see if we can push it further on FOC on the consumer side, right?
Right. I mean, this is all the tricky part. I mean, like the thing is people are like, why isn't comics marketing better for single issue comics and things like that? And there's a number of factors. The 3-month release window. I mean, like, there's just no way to do it in a sustained way. And also because of that, it makes it very difficult and very opaque as to whether or not you've had any impact with your advertising. The interesting thing is, one retailer told me that, actually, I hear this regularly. Like, shops regularly tell me that they love working with Boom because you do such a good job of taking care of them. But one recently told me they always want to order heavier than they can, but customers don't always buy into the degree that matches their desire to support you. And that's like one of the tricky things, is because of how difficult the market can be to promote and how to how do you drive that consumer interest? It's like, you can get retailers to order, but because of all the systemic things that are happening, it can be difficult to like fuel the same passion in the customers that go into those shops. And I imagine that's just a constant challenge you're dealing with.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it's one of the things we've been thinking about a lot recently, particularly in the context of a very crowded market, right? Like we talked about earlier, we've maintained our publishing slate and kept it curated and kept it at the same level for 3 years. Our competitors haven't, right? So we're making a strategic and conscious choice to take this is not meant to this is not meant to be a shot at other publishers, but it's like we're taking a quality over quantity approach, which isn't to say that you can't produce a lot of content at a high quality. But the thing we risk there is, now we're assuming retailers are full line comic shops, meaning that they carry, let's call it 85, 90% of what's being put out into the market. We're making a conscious decision to be a smaller presence in store, right? So one of the things we've been looking at going into ComicsPRO and into this year is, how do we arm the retailers with point of sale items in the store? Because I'm sure you've had the same experience, right? Like, I walk into my comic shop every week and I'm on the internet all the time. I'm getting served up all the advertising. I'm on comic social media. I'm reading the news articles. You walk in and you immediately like forget everything. Like, you might be walking and going like, I want to pick up this one book, but it's not like you can remember all the things that are coming out that week, right?
Sometimes I actually look at my own article, the poll that I do on Wednesdays, just so I can remember what I'm going to buy. I cross-check it against what I'm actually buying in the moment. That's how foggy my memory is.
But I think we're all there, right? Because like, retailers aren't the only ones comic shop retailers aren't the only ones whose lives have become more complex. Everybody is working harder than they were 3 years ago just to like navigate the world, right? So you walk into the store and now you're just kind of staring at a wall of stuff, and depending how much time you have in the store, you may miss out on something you would have been interested in. And as I touched on before, like I think retailers have less time to actually do that hand selling work that might have put it in your hands in the first place. So one of the questions we've been asking ourselves is, how do we give retailers tools, point of sales items that help do the work for them? I was in Golden Apple earlier this afternoon and talking with Ryan, the owner, and Joe, his manager, and I was saying, like to me, it almost feels like when you walk into like, do you guys have Bevmos up in Alaska? What's your
No.
like wine store, liquor store, beer store equivalent?
Oh, we just have some local ones. Yeah, we have like a brown jug, but then we have a local one called La Bodega, which is very popular. Do not have them anywhere else, unfortunately.
Well, I just want to say, like, I now want to visit a brown jug because that might be the greatest name for a liquor store I have ever
I
heard.
don't. You should not aspire to that, Philip. It's not that special.
Okay. So well, you walk into La Bodega, right? And you're looking for a bottle of wine, and chances like all the labels look cool, but
Oh yeah.
basically the same. Do you know the difference between a $15 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon and a $30 bottle? Probably not. Not really. And so, like, what do? We look at those like little write-ups, right? We look at, oh, this one's a 90 point out of 100, and somebody who apparently knows more than I do says it's really good. Great. I'm gonna pick this one over the other one. So I think looking at like what are the uh, activations we can do in store that don't require more work from the retailers this year that can help us stand out, can help drive the messaging and reinforce the messaging that we're trying to do. So yeah, we'll be announcing some of that at ComicsPRO and some of the things we intend to send retailers and activate for them. And the other piece of it is, I think the trend has been over the last year and a half for publishers to reduce the amount of returnability they're offering, from the height of 2020, where basically everything was returnable. We're going to try to reverse that trend and say, look, we understand it's crowded, it's confusing, the market doesn't make sense to you. Like I'm hearing that a lot from retailers, like all of the tools used to use to like make sound business decisions, those rules don't apply anymore. Okay, great. So let us extend more returnability. So if you're that retailer that likes Boom and wants to support Boom, you can take a position and you're not going to pay the cost of it if collectively we're wrong.
I think that'll be a pretty popular move. It does seem like returnability was really appealing for a period for a lot of publishers, but also for retailers. But then it became like this double-edged sword to some degree. And I think that with your line, it's a little bit more palatable because it's not so expansive. Before we move on from the Kickstarter, totally, I had two things I want to bring up involving that. One, you mentioned the ebooks thing. I thought the ebooks thing was really interesting, how the original series was very popular in ebooks. One of the most curious things about the whole thing is, to me, is the fact that it's being rolled out in a few capacities. You got the ultra high end stuff, which I find to be really fascinating. You have the collections in a variety of forms. You have the 12. It's a 12 issue maxi series, finite series, whatever you want to call it, and that's coming out both in digital and in single issues, or like print single issues. And
Yeah.
the thing is when I first read it, the first thing that really stood out to me was the fact that this was a 12 issue series that was in the FOC, or it's in the order window, but you're also offering here. And naturally in my head, some warning signs went off. I was like, oh, I don't know about that. Retailers gonna be pretty mad. Most retailers I talk to don't really care. Not really a big deal to them because they say that you offer the same thing to them if they really want it. But the thing that stood out to me when I looked at the numbers was the single issue print tier had the fewest backers. The digital one had the second most, so I think it was 600 for single issue print, 900 for digital, 2,700 plus for soft covers, and 2,300 plus for hardcovers. That was really fascinating and kind of eye-opening to me, and it does kind of speak to that ebooks background where it's like you have these digital native readers who are already on board with it. The thing I want to ask about it, though, is how much of what you do with these Kickstarters is, to some degree, designed to experiment and figure out what these audiences are responding to? Like, do you feel like you learn a lot from each of these campaigns?
Yeah, absolutely. So like one thing you noted was our offering of single issue sets for this, right?
Right.
And that's an experiment
It's the
to
first one you've done,
see.
right?
It's the first one we've done, right? And so typically what we do is we limit the number of experiments we're running in each campaign, right? Because you don't want to run 10 experiments and then you don't know
What caused what?
what caused what, right? Yeah, exactly. And so like part of our thinking here was, okay, well, uh, let's offer out a single issue option. But the key thing for us is we never want to do these things at the expense of the existing markets or the existing audience, right? So what we offered out was you can only order it as a set. So you're committing to the entire series because ultimately our goal with this is, again, connecting with Expanse readers and turning them into comic readers, right? So I don't want, if people want to sample, there's plenty of other places they can sample. I want you to get in, have the whole experience, and then on the other side of that, decide, do I want to keep going either with more Expanse comic books if we do more, or am I now interested in other things Boom is doing? Am I now interested in checking out We Only Find Them When They're Dead because that's a brilliant, 15 issue sci-fi series that I think like Expanse fans would love if they checked out. So you have to order it as a set. It's high-end variant editions, right? So these books are roughly $2.50 more per copy than what you can pick up at your local comic shop. And then the third thing is we're shipping in 3 waves, right? So essentially, you're going to get issues 1 through 4 at the same time as the people that order the soft covers get volume 1 and the hard covers get volume 1. And so we've engineered it very intentionally to not compete with the person that's like, I want to be there as it releases. I want the best price. And I'm a completist, right? You can't get everything we're doing with the single issues through the Kickstarter. You have to go to comic shops. And that's one of the things we did with Berserker. One of the things we'll do with this campaign is when issue 1 comes out in April, every one of those backers is going to get a message from us saying, hey, issue 1's coming out. Let's say we'll send out the message on a Monday. It's coming out on Wednesday. The only place you can get it is your local comic shop. Here's how you find a comic shop if you're interested, right? And I do think it's interesting, though, that as deep as this fandom is, and clearly based on the fact that all of the high-end tiers have sold out, it's not a question of like, am I a collector? Am I willing to spend, a significant, like a premium price to get the thing that I love? But I think they're readers first and foremost. And so they're looking at it going, well, like, what's the thing I can put up on my shelf? And my prediction is when this campaign ends, and this is what we told retailers, which is why I think they're not frustrated, is I think the total print run on these variant covers, which are going to be awesome because Jamie McKelvey's doing them, is going to basically be similar to what we would offer out through like a convention exclusive or a retailer exclusive, right? I think the other thing that you noted that's really fascinating to me is the soft covers, right? So these are the exact same soft covers you're going to be able to get through other channels, and through other channels you're going to be able to buy them less expensively if you want, right? Like there's nobody in the world that doesn't know how to access Amazon. And so really the value proposition here is you get to be part of the communal experience of this campaign, where you're going to get some free stuff from the stretch goals that you're not going to be able to access otherwise. But more importantly, I think for a casual consumer, they're getting to click a button once, and now they know that they're getting the entire 3-volume set to their door with nothing else. Like the only other thing they're going to have to do is verify their shipping address.
Right.
And I think that does solve a problem for that person that's really passionate about the Expanse, but not necessarily passionate about graphic novels yet.
I think that the appeal of Kickstarter in some ways too is just how easy it is. It's like you just do it once and then you get it later. And that's what in theory, that's how it's supposed to work. It doesn't always work like that.
Yeah.
I do have to say, I do think that there's to some degree, like when I was doing some Twitter searching involving like the Kickstarter, and it seems like there's some fans who are like so passionate about the Expanse that they almost want it to succeed just so they can be like, look, our fandom is legion. You have to bring the show back or do X or do Y or whatever. It's like,
Yeah.
it's almost like proof of concept for them. Last thing I want to bring up with the Kickstarter. I think the one point you brought up that I hadn't really thought about a whole lot was with this and with Berserker, it's both in the order window. And so, like you're saying, that is actually promotion for the book itself because it's raising notoriety of it. You have all these articles being written about this and always mentioning that it's also launching in April if you want to get the first issue. That, I think, is really powerful. And I hadn't really considered that before. There's one bit of information that I once got from a retailer who told me, especially recently, that the more comics that are kickstarted before becoming single issue comics, the more they're finding consumers to be less interested. Because I don't know, they didn't expand as to why, whether or not it's because they already bought it via Kickstarter or they already have kind of felt like it came out or something like that. But it seemed that like in recent years, that's waned. Now that's become a much more common tactic and it's not always executed in the same way that you're doing it. But is that something you're really conscientious of like balancing in-store sales versus like the Kickstarter effort and making sure that all sides feel not burned by the process?
Yeah, yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about it, and not just comic shops, thinking about independent bookstores, thinking about our other channels. Even when we were first launching Berserker, being thoughtful about how we offered the digital components so that we weren't negatively impacting Comixology's business because they're an existing channel for us. So it's something we watch very carefully, and not to say that we won't ever misstep because it's entirely possible. Like you said, we're running experiments here. But we're really thoughtful about making this line of business incremental and not at the expense of other pieces of business that we have.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. It's Bad Idea, and the Renegade comic book publisher is back doing their crazy antics. The latest includes putting a comic from Mark Waid and David Lapham, The First Supper, into a recent edition of Previews for Order completely randomly. Or it was the latest, until Bad Idea also snuck a new comic from Joshua Dysart and Kano, The First 7 Days, into the same edition of Previews. Don't worry if you missed it, because you probably should have, as it was hidden under the publisher named B-Side Press with fake creator names. That's how Bad Idea rolls, though, making notable comics with great creators in extraordinarily unusual ways. Keep your eye out for whatever's next with Bad Idea, if you can. And now, back to the show. The funny thing is when I initially mentioned, because I wrote about it and I talked about how, I was really surprised by the single issue element. It would be a lot easier to feel like you're getting burned as a retailer if the number wasn't like 600 or something. Like 600 is a pretty small number ultimately in the total single issue buyer market out there. And it is interesting to see like because that's one of the other things about Kickstarter is you can actually see what's driving like what's motivating people. And it really does seem like it's the collections. But I do want to talk about format in specific because, you've obviously had a ton of success with Kickstarters for collections of comics like Klaus and Giant Days and Power Rangers and etc. You've also had some really effective launches lately with Grimm, Breyer, Mosley, etc. Mosley, I really like Mosley. I just want to say.
It's a great book.
Great book. Obviously, the former was fed by like single issue titles that were eventually collected. But I'm getting a lot of trepidation about single issues and how effective they are right now. Internally, do you feel like there's been any shift in focus as to what's the most valuable to boom format-wise, or what audiences are responding to the most in the past couple of years? Or is it, let's not say past couple of years because for aforementioned reasons, but do you feel like there's like your focus is turning at all, or do you still feel like the balance is pretty much what it was before?
I think the balance is largely where it was. And I think the thing that is often underestimated is that for a publisher, single issues function not just as a really important revenue stream, an important piece of the like industry, medium, etc., but they in and of themselves are helping market new things, right? So it's very consistent. Like we know from experience that a lot of librarians that are curating graphic novel collections are reading single issues and they're making buying decisions based on their own personal reading experience with that, right?
Hmm.
And I think it can't be underestimated how, that combined with the fact that there's such a built-in system for promotion around single issues, and it's this weekly thing that in a world where we can seemingly never have enough new information and new content, like that is a powerful engine for like the medium as a whole, right? And so I think, when you look at campaigns like Klaus or Giant Days, I'll talk about like, Giant Days very simply was we we were trying to solve a problem, which was when we first did hardcovers for Giant Days, we modeled them, uh, you know, transparently, we modeled them on what Image was doing with hardcovers at the time, which was typically it was collecting 2 volumes of a soft cover, and the price point was around $35, right? And then we thought, well, we'll do these like really beautifully designed, kind of like cloth bound covers. And the feedback we got as we got into the program was these are too expensive. They and from libraries they damage too easily,
Mm.
right? Because of the cloth binding would get scuffed up and it would get dirty, and essentially it wasn't durable enough, right? So we had been wanting for quite a while to essentially do a redo on that format because we felt like there was an opportunity for Giant Days as a series to work in hardcover, to be a perennial item in libraries, in comic shops, and bookstores. But we knew we had kind of missed. And at the same time, because we had stopped with volume three, we had, let's call it 2,500, 3,000 of the most diehard Giant Days fans who were going to want to, torch and pitchfork us if we didn't allow them to complete their collection. We've all been there, right?
Yeah.
And so the Kickstarter was really born out of, we felt like we had to create proof of concept for uh, libraries and book market. We felt like we needed a way to complete those not on the test editions in a way that wasn't going to be financially irresponsible for us as a company. And then on top of that, we were able to layer in this uh, book donation component for libraries and really build it around, creating these beautiful editions that we hope are going to be a perennial in the space. And people seem to have reacted to it now. And something like Klaus is, again, it goes back to being able to create these like really high end editions of a book that we love and we're really proud of, that probably wouldn't make sense at retail.
I gotta say, those not on a test ones, those are the ones that drew my eye. Although I have to say, I know that you don't have control over this sort of thing. The shipping to Alaska was mind blowing. I was like, I don't even know why Alaska is so expensive. This is crazy, but
that's one of the things that honestly is continuing to be a learning for us, is just like finding the right fulfillment partners and figuring out how to direct ship to customers. It's the thing that as a publisher you take for granted because we have a great distribution network, right?
right.
And so I think that is one of the things that we're continuing to evolve and get better at. But I would tell you, yeah, we're figuring out the thing about the shipping on the Kickstarters is we just treat it as a pass through. It's literally like we're getting a quote and saying, okay, this is what it's going to cost us. Our challenge is figuring out how to get it to cost less, because ultimately, that's a fine thing to say, but for you as a customer or anybody else, it's like, right, but I still don't want to pay this shipping cost.
Well, and the other thing too is I talked to somebody who also, who ended up doing the Giant Days one, and I think they said that their shipping ended up being considerably less than it was projected as, because I imagine that like that changes too. It's like what it is today might be different than like, let's say 3 months, 6 months, whatever, when you actually ship. But I did want to talk about one thing you mentioned in there, which is the idea that you spoke to it in general, but I've heard this from several retailers lately where once upon a time it was like there's the idea that single issues are cash flow and they're constantly like they're like kind of what keeps retailers and creators going, and then publishers is where, or excuse me, collections are where like the big money theoretically could be earned. And it used to be that it's like kind of single issues first, or like kind of top of the tier, and then collections were kind of second as like the benefit, like that it feeds into the second format. But now I've been talking to a number of retailers who've told me things that like single issues often act more like a trailer for like the eventual trade release. And I think that ties into the idea of sampling, how a lot of readers are like reading first issues and then maybe making a decision from there as to whether or not they want to buy the trade eventually. And I do think, as per usual, I don't want to say that these few thoughts are necessarily representative of the whole, but I do kind of feel like there's some sort of shift going on with single issues right now. You know, a lot of retailers tell me it's just more of a guessing game than it used to be. What have you been seeing lately in regards to that? Do you see like some sort of shift going on, or is it a little too early to tell for anything like that?
I think it's probably a little too early to tell. What I will say is that like there's always that like apocryphal example of like Transmet, right? Like this thing didn't work in single issues, and then the trade sales were gigantic, right? That was always kind of like the Vertigo proposition, was like, yeah. We know that like these books don't sell that well in single issues, but look at these trade numbers.
I think Runaways was pretty similar too, where it's like at first it didn't do well in single issues, and then like the digest editions came out, and then all of a sudden they did really well.
Right. But I think those examples stand out, but they really are much less frequent than you would think. Like
Yeah.
things that do well in single issues tend to do well in collections. Things that don't do well in single issues tend not to do well in collections. And I think at the end of the day, it's like it's too early to tell, in my opinion, if there's any kind of like shift in the buying habits or the reading habits. I think what maybe we're seeing is more a reaction to how crowded the market is rather than people shifting format wise, right? Like there are so many different single issues out there and available, and new things launching each week, that it's harder for customers to focus. And what wouldn't surprise me is that, you know, years ago, I made the analogy of like at a ComicsPRO about taking a Trader Joe's approach to
I remember this.
Merchandise, and I think the paralyzation of too much choice is a real thing, and it would not surprise me if some customers are walking in, grabbing their normal, either their pulls or the books that they normally pick up, then looking at the wall, being overwhelmed, and instead of choosing one thing, not choosing anything, right?
Well, I mean, also, even beyond that, it's like the sampling stuff is probably related to that as well, in the sense that, if, let's say, any given week, I don't even know what the number is, any given week there's 150 comics released. Your choice is between, do I want to get the second issue of a comic I liked but didn't love, or read the first issue of something that I might love? And like that becomes a choice, the unknown versus like the somewhat known. Like, how do you choose between those two? And that's a battle for consumers. And similarly, that's a battle for everyone down the chain.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's where like, our hope is that by engaging deeper, like in store, and helping that decision-making process, because we all know that, things like a creator we like recommending something has an influence on whether we try something. Positive review, other people liking the thing that we liked but didn't love may make us like it more, or at least give it another shot, right?
Right.
Like a reviewer, like if you pick up an issue 1 and you liked it but didn't love it, and then you read some reviews that say, oh man, issue 2, just like The Last of Us is a great example, right?
Oh,
like
yeah.
there were plenty of people who were into it. Man, you get to episode 4 and everybody's losing their mind, and now you feel like you're missing out, right? And so, one of our challenges as a publisher is how do we get that information when we have something that's working in front of customers to have that influence and get them to pick us, frankly, over some other choice they might have.
This is a quick aside. I just want to say shouts to Faith Erin Hicks for sitting on all of her original pages from the Last of Us miniseries she did and selling them when the show came out. I don't even know if that was intentional by Faith, but good for her because those pages are selling out
Yes.
quick. Every time I go to look to see how much they cost, I can't find out because it just says sold under them. It's unbelievable. Good for her.
And that's awesome because how many times do we hear those stories of like an artist that has sold, some original art
Oh,
way
right.
before it peaked, and now, ultimately it's a buyer three steps removed that's really capitalizing on the opportunity.
I remember there was, God, I think it was a page of Jim Lee's that Scott Williams inked, and he said he sold his inks for like $50, like back in like 1990 or something like that, and then it sold for like $1.2 million. And he was just like, kind of wish I had that one back. But last question on the kind of this track, the number one, number two thing that we're talking about, I do think that that is kind of related to another trend that's been happening in the past couple years, the finite series. There's been a heavy lean in that direction. Now, Boom, I feel like you guys have always been kind of on the mini possible ongoing path. Like, Once and Future was a mini that became an ongoing. Lumberjanes was a mini that became an ongoing, et cetera, et cetera. Do you view that shift towards finite series, which is really, I mean, it's like a 20% jump in just like 3 years, basically, in terms of how much that's risen. Do you view that as a response to the current market, or does it have more, like for you, for Boom, does it have more to do with what's right for each title?
Generally, I think it's more to do with what's right. But I will say, I always go back to a quote that I attribute to Robert Kirkman, and I think is accurate, which is essentially like he was asked once, why do you think The Walking Dead is so successful and it resonated in a way that other zombie fiction at that time didn't hit in the same way? And his answer was basically like, I don't know, if I did, I would have 10 of them, right? Which kind of like
Right.
goes back to the piece of creating new content, new entertainment is as much art and luck as it is science, right? And so you can have all the right ingredients. You can have a brilliant creative team. You can have a great concept. You can have amazing execution, and it still might not connect, right? So I would say that, it is always safer for a publisher to launch something in a limited capacity and then double down if it works than it is to come out of the gate and say, we're doing 60 issues of this series, right? That being said, I think just like some other elements in the market, now we've kind of like swung a little too far in one direction. And so one of the things we're looking at this year is how do we either take deeper positions on things that are working, like a Briar, like a Damn Them All, like a Stuff of Nightmares. And then the other thing we're looking at is how do we maybe go another round with something that did connect with the market, because at least it's something familiar, right? One of the things we're hearing from retailers is, there's not enough kind of consistent anchor points on my shelves that I can rely on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the challenges is when you have traditionally things like Batman and Spider-Man are going to be those anchor points, but when there's such a wide swath of material available for those cornerstone properties, it makes it hard to pick which one is the anchor point, right? It just kind of like diffuses. So I think we're going to try to do what we can to say, here's things you can count on, things will work. And when we have an opportunity to work with somebody like Jason Aaron, and he's coming to us and saying, I have a vision for 15 issues, it's a big commitment. It's not a crazy commitment, but it's a big commitment. And you want to do it because you know that ultimately that execution is what's right for the project, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus other things where somebody comes in and says, hey, I've got like, a 4 or 5 or 6 issue story I want to tell, and I've got more if it works. And then, you just pay attention to the market and try to double down when you can.
I feel like that 15 to 18 area is a pretty sweet spot. Like the 3 trades or the, I don't know, 2 hardcovers or whatever range. Like that seems like it's a pretty nice area. And you had a number of titles that exist in there. There's 7 Secrets was 18, I think. I always want to say what's the furthest place from here, even though I know we only find them when they're dead. God, we only find
You
when
know, you
them.
got it. We only find them when they're dead. Yeah, 15 issues for that one. Yeah.
I think both of them starting with the W just throws me off, and they're so long. But we only find them when they're dead is 15.
Eric Harbour, one of our editors, I'm convinced, is in an unofficial Cold War with Matthew Rosenberg for who can publish the longest title.
We need to make it official. That's going to spice things up. We're going to get the Comics Press talking.
Take it to Twitter, right?
But I think that it is interesting how that area, like, I feel like you had more of those anchor points a few years ago where it was like Once and Future, we only find them when they're dead. You had Seven Secrets. And like right now, it's a lot of the books that are kind of long running, is Power Rangers, obviously, but like there aren't any of those ones that I feel like are kind of in that same space, but maybe that's just because the current generation is being born in front of us. And like it's cyclical in some ways.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's like right now, we've got the Two Something is Killing the Children.
Oh, right.
Titles, House of Slaughter and Something is Killing the Children. You know, Berserker, the initial series is finite at 12 issues, but we've signaled, and I don't think it'll surprise anybody, that there's more Berserker coming.
Right.
And so we expect that that'll continue to be like an anchor point for the industry. And then actually we announced a series with Cullen Bunn earlier this week,
with Leo Max.
With Leo Max.
I love Leo Max.
Open. Yeah, that one's open-ended. I think, you know, we're and you know, one thing you said that I think is really astute is there is also it's very difficult for retailers, whether we're talking about bookstores or comic shops, to continue to support the series once you get past a certain number of collected volumes, right? Which is why you see now publishers are starting to, like, after a period of time, it's like, okay, we had like a 10 volume series. How do we condense it down to 5 volumes so that it's reasonable to have that on the shelf, as opposed to, you know, I'm sure you've had this experience. You go into a store and it's like, okay, there's volume 1 through 3, and then whatever the last 2 volumes are. And if you want the middle stuff, you got to special order it. So I think we think a fair amount about that. But yeah, I would say, you know, heading into ComicsPRO this week, keep an eye out for Breyer and Damn Them All news in that vein.
In regards to the volumes thing, that's especially a problem for manga. Some manga is like very, very long. So it's like if you're getting Berserk or something, it's like the first 2 are there, and then like maybe the last 2, but there's like a 60 volume gap between those 2 or something like that.
As the father of 2 preteens that got deeply into My Hero Academia in the last, you know, year and a half, and I'm trying to like catch up on the manga, and I want to support independent retail, but you know, there's a lot of volumes. And then, you know, there were the supply challenges as well over the last couple of years too.
Absolutely. Well, I did want to ask, like, we've talked about a lot of the positive things, a lot of the things that have been kind of like all over the place, but do you feel like there's been anything that, you know, Boom is struggling to make work at all, or something that isn't quite working as well as you expected? Has there been anything that might have surprised you the past couple of years? Or, okay, let's not do the past couple of years, the past year or so.
That's a great question. One that I think I should have been more prepared for.
I'm sure you're going to hear plenty about it next week.
Yeah, I think, honestly, one of the things that maybe shouldn't have been surprising, but was surprising, is just how disruptive the distribution shakeup was. You know, having not lived through the first wave of distribution splintering and consolidation in the mid 90s, I didn't have that firsthand experience. And I think it's really been interesting and in some ways challenging to see how that fracturing has impacted both Diamond, who we're with, you know, and obviously there's shifts in their volume that they're dealing with that impacts publishers like us and Image that are still distributing through Diamond exclusively to comic shops, and then also how much having to deal with multiple distributors impacted retailers. And so it's just harder to get people's attention, you know, because they're inundated with so much information from so many different sources. You know, I think most retailers would tell you there was already too much information coming at them, but at least it was coming from relatively few sources, and there was a consistency. to how it was coming over and the cadence of it. I mean, I think there's always things where this is not unique to 2022 or 2023, where you think, oh, this thing is a fastball down the middle and it's going to connect, and for whatever reason, it doesn't. It doesn't connect with the market in the way that you hope, and then the question becomes, well, what else can we do to support it and continue building it? And not to turn this back to the positive, but the flip side of that is something like Grimm, where we knew we had a good book and we were excited to be working with Stephanie and Flaviano, and we thought it was going to be successful, but it popped in a way that was completely unexpected. I don't know if that really answers your question, David. But
I mean, you can only tell the story you have. I do think it's interesting though, because the distribution situation has required like some adjustments. I mean, I think, was it last ComicsPRO that you talked about how no, I think it was like a Diamond Retailer Summit where you talked about how you were doing some stuff with them to try to mitigate some of the shipping costs.
Yeah.
And like that type of stuff. I mean, that's one of the interesting things I think about the current space is there's like multiple levels to like where issues can come from. And that's always been the case, but I feel like it's definitely the case, maybe more so in the past few years, where there's been significant changes to the digital landscape. I don't think I need to address what those are, but I mean, let's just say it's been torn asunder and thrown upside down and yada, yada, yada. Distribution has changed completely. How much of a challenge, or how much of the challenge from the past couple of years has just been trying to negotiate all the things that are completely outside your control?
That's a big piece of it. And actually, it's funny you brought up digital, because that popped into my head right after I finished speaking. Is like, there was a long period of time where like digital was not something we really had to think about as a publisher. Like, we knew what the channels were, they were relatively stable, they were predictable. And so this is like one of the ways that I think as a publisher we can relate to what comic shops are going through, which is, the way that has shifted has been so dramatic, and there's not a clear path of like, how do we get back to where we were? There's no clear marketplace to pivot to, and to service those customers. And the concern, of course, as a publisher is like, you don't want those customers to go away because they don't have a place to get what they need. Yeah, I think it's the disruption and kind of the unpredictability of the market, which, in some ways it's fun to solve problems and it's interesting and it keeps things, keeps us on our toes. But there's a lot of disruption in virtually every sector, and some of it's good and some of it's bad.
Well, and I would say like the biggest difficulties here is the fact that like, for the most part, the disruption we're talking about has not been overly positive. I mean, I do think that there are benefits to the distribution side, but the digital stuff, I mean, it's hard to say that that's been positive for really anybody in regards to that. Now, granted that might result in other solutions coming up, and perhaps those prove to be useful. But at the same time, that's not like that customer that's looking like, how do if I'm in Australia and I want to buy Giant Days on digital and you can't find it or something, like, what's your solution right now? You have literally no solution. So that is one of the difficult things, is like disruption. I think there's this romanticized idea of disruption that I hope that Glass Onion has now destroyed, but I don't know if it's always as rosy as people think it is. It can just be disruptive.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true.
Well, last question I have for you. We're headed to ComicsPRO. We're in a new year, a year that a lot of people in the industry, I would say, have been hopeful about, but also have uneasy feelings about. It's a bit, as per usual, it's like, I hope it's going to be good, but I don't know what it's going to have in store for us. How are you feeling about where things are headed in 2023 and beyond? Are you feeling pretty good about what's coming for Boom as we head into the exciting ComicsPRO week?
Yeah, I am. And it's funny. I think in some ways I feel the same way that maybe Patrick from Challengers enunciated at the end of your conversation with him, which is like, I am excited about what we're doing. I'm excited about comics. I think like I go to the comic shop every week and I think there's a ton of amazing content and stories being told. And that has me really enthusiastic about going to ComicsPRO. I don't tend to worry about the things that I can control. It's like getting on the road and driving. It's like, I feel good about how I'm driving.
Yeah.
It's everybody else I got to worry about,
Yeah.
And so, the stuff that keeps me up at night is the decisions, some of which are going to be like short-term thinking that are going to impact Boom that we don't have control over. But in terms of like getting in there and having a great 3 or 4 days with a bunch of really smart retailers and seeing a bunch of our publishing peers that I know we're going to get good conversation and good ideas out of, very excited about that. Very excited about the type of stuff that we're publishing this year. I think we've got a really strong slate and a bunch of stuff that is working. And so, I would say overall really positive. And the philosophy this year is just pay attention, pay close attention, be listening. I think like the big theme of our ComicsPRO presentation and the way that we're engaging with retailers is like, let's all pay attention and listen. And listening is more than just waiting for your chance to speak. It's about trying to get information out of people that are outside of your bubble and put together a good picture of reality.
Yeah. Well, also you get to go to Pittsburgh, which I've heard is strangely a very up and coming cool city. The only vision I have of Pittsburgh is basically like Steelers games and Pirates games, which is, it turns out, not the best representation of a city, but I've heard good things. But you're going to find out all about that next week, Philip. That's all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Boom Studios, ComicsPRO, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
I appreciate your time, David, and the questions were awesome. So thanks for this conversation. It's always fun.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Boom Studios President of Publishing and Marketing, Filip Sablik. You can find him on Twitter at Filip Sablik. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at SketchComic or following me at SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Kevin Bides, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Matteo Ciccati, Chris Ray, Near Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Cancel Comics, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Jingo Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Rom V, Devin Fitzsimons, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Norb Studios Comics, Nicholas Palmieri, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Brian, Submed Industries, Raj Patel, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Bradley Rader, Carl Choi, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Broward, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Walt's Comics and Books, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Dave Slusher, Akil, Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, and Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Stables, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.